Welcome to Rashtra Sevak, our YouTube channel. I am your host Rohan Deshpande.
And I am Chaitanya Sabnis.
Today we bring you a topic on the Battle of Marathas, and we have with us author and historian Mr. Anish Gokhale to enlighten on this topic. Mr. Anish, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Mr. Anish, we all know Hindvi Swarajya was started by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. But before the advent of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, if we see, there is a huge vacuum left over for almost a century where there was no decisive Hindu power in place. So, when Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj started his campaign, what were the typical infrastructure available at that time in the empire? Also, what challenges did he face? Could you please enlighten on this?
So, Chhatrapati Shivaji of the 17th century, and when he was born, about 300 years had passed since the last Hindu power had been extinguished in western Maharashtra. That is the Yadavs of Devgiri. And it is believed that Chhatrapati Shivaji from his mother's side had descended from the Devgiri Yadavs. Prior to the Devgiri Yadavs falling to Alauddin Khilji at the end of the 13th century in 1296, we find that there have been some instances of the local Maharashtrian rulers defending against invaders. But Alauddin Khilji's invasion was very destructive, and in that campaign it completely wiped out the Yadav kingdom of Devgiri to such an extent that no trace was left of it. It existed in some form for next 10-15 years as a vassal of Alauddin Khilji, but then the last Yadav king, he tried to revolt against Khilji. Khilji sent another army and completely finished the entire kingdom. From that point on, in this part of the country, in western Maharashtra, there was no Hindu power for the next about 300 years at least. So, one thing that Chhatrapati Shivaji did not have with him was the advantage of having a history that said something positive about Hindu rule in the past 2-3 centuries. There was nobody alive who had lived through those times. There had been one kingdom of the Vijayanagar. The Vijayanagar kingdom had existed right up to almost to the end of the 16th century, but that also had been extinguished by the time Shivaji Maharaj was born. So primarily the problems or the issues that Chhatrapati Shivaji faced were that one, history wasn't with him. In 300 years nobody had established an independent Hindu kingdom in this part of the country, one thing. Secondly, the manner in which these kingdoms were lost was something that Chhatrapati Shivaji had to guard against if he was to not end up suffering the same fate. The Devgiri Yadavs made some cardinal strategic errors because of which they lost. One was that their intelligence department, their spy department wasn't very effective. He found out about Khilji when he was around 15 miles away from the capital city. 15 miles away from the capital, he found out that the invading army has reached, which is hardly any distance. It has started actually from Delhi. So army started from Delhi to attack him. It's something he found only 15 miles away, and after that it was very difficult to defend against it because you're not prepared. Same time, we find that one of his best generals was away to the south on some campaign. Again, this is a corollary of the first fact that your army, invading army, is coming from the north. You should recall your forces to defend. Then internal administration, we can see how good or bad it is. They believe that they had the fort to be sufficiently stocked for about 1 year or 2 years, but when the granary was opened, they found that instead of the grains, there was salt inside the granary. And then there were problems with the fort construction. There was only one entrance and exit. So Alauddin Khilji didn't have to do anything apart from blocking one entrance. Then you had a disinformation campaign where Alauddin Khilji then let out a rumor that another huge army from Delhi is coming to block whatever remains around. Some end result was that the Yadavs of Devgiri lost their kingdom. So these were the points that Shivaji Maharaj had to first guard against happening to his own kingdom. when he had to establish Hindu Swaraj. And when we come to the Battle of Talikota, in which the Vijayanagar Empire lost, we saw that the Deccan Sultanates, all four of them, had come together and attacked Vijayanagar in that battle. But prior to that battle also problems have started surfacing. There was a lot of dynastic rule in Vijayanagar by that time, something that Shivaji Maharaj guarded against very diligently, is to not have his relatives and friends in all kinds of administrative positions. It was always on merit basis, whatever he did. And this is one of the reasons that really created a weak kingdom, is that the incumbent Ramdev Raya had put all his relatives in ministerial positions instead of going by their merit. Lastly, on being defeated by the Deccan Sultanates, Ramdev Raya was beheaded and his head was put as a trophy, so as to demoralize the population. This is your king. Shivaji Maharaj had to create a kingdom where such kind of one-off act doesn't demoralize the entire kingdom. Even if the king dies, it should be able to survive. Which means that he had to devise policies and a sense of belonging to Hindu Swarajya on everybody's part, rather than just create a sense of belonging to Shivaji Maharaj. So the people had to fight for Hindu Swarajya, not fight merely for Chhatrapati Shivaji. And we can see this, that his policies are successful when after his death Marathas continued to fight for 27 years. And in spite of Chhatrapati Sambhaji being killed in a very cruel manner, and Aurangzeb tried the exact same thing. He beheaded Chhatrapati Sambhaji and displayed his head, which is known history. That Chhatrapati Sambhaji was beheaded and the head was displayed so that Marathas got totally demoralized. The same way it had happened in Talikota earlier. But it is to Shivaji Maharaj's credit that he had the vision and policies in place that could prevent that kind of thing from happening. So these are the challenges that were there, and Hindu Swaraj is about being able to put in place the systems that does not create a repeat of them in Maharashtra.
So Anishji, as you said that Shivaji Maharaj did start Swarajya and fighting against all the odds, and he, with small battles with his small army, he did find some land and he brought a freedom to that land, we can say. So first major battle which comes to mind is Afzal Khan's battle in 1659, which was a very odd battle, that Afzal Khan himself was a very brave soldier and very feared soldier, and Maratha army was a very small army. So can you elaborate on that battle?
Yes. So Chhatrapati Shivaji started taking forts from the Adil Shah Bijapur around 1646. Start of Torana. Now there is a bit of argument as to which is the first fort. Some say it is Torana, some say it is Purandar, some point to some smaller fort near Pune, but more or less we take the start as Torana. Swaraj is Toran man live. So, and at that time he took the forts as a junior officer of Adil Shah. This is the kind of letters he sent. You have sent me to Pune. I am taking these forts under me so as to be able to administer them better. And Shahaji Raja played a very crucial role in this at Bangalore. That he said that this is what he is doing, and we sent him supplies accordingly. He sent even a few ministers from his side. Dadaji Konde actually minister sent by Shahaji Raja, and even further even Kanoji Jedhe and others are actually Shahaji Raja's ministers who have been sent to help Shivaji Maharaj. So in these formative years where a wrong step could have really caused a lot of damage, it is Shahaji Raja who managed to, might say, hoodwink Adil Shah, and as a result quite a few forts came under Shivaji Maharaj administration. Finally Adil Shah decided to send an army. He first sent smaller armies against both Sambhaji and Shivaji Maharaj. Sambhaji being his elder brother, who was finally killed by Afzal Khan later on at Kanakgiri. And then it came to 1659 where Adil Shah decided that Chhatrapati Shivaji has to be defeated and put down for good, because he's becoming a thorn in his side. And the Pratapgarh campaign is actually his toughest test at the time. He is very young. Shivaji Maharaj is maybe around 30 years old at the time, more or less your or my age. And we find that he is faced with a general who is almost twice his age, who has led armies all over South India. Afzal Khan is Ali Adil Shah's topmost generals. It is with good reason that he selects him. Yes, more or less, we listen to the folk tale goes that Begum Sahiba asked who is willing to defeat Chhatrapati Shivaji, and Afzal Khan steps forward, nobody else willing to step forward. But given the kind of preparation and his track record, it's quite possible that Adil Shah defeated him on purpose. And this may or may not be a true story. Darbar just given a choice who is going to attack. Because everybody is going to think before strategizing instead of just ad hoc awarding the campaign to somebody. You find Afzal Khan is one of the most competent in his kingdom. He has led armies all over South India. He is believed to be responsible for his elder brother's death. So this is another psychological warfare Adil Shah is trying to play. I am sending your brother's killer. And along the way, he does a lot of temple destruction. People have to take the idols and move out. And Shivaji Maharaj now basically has to depend on what is guerrilla warfare. The guerrilla warfare is not just fighting in trees and ravines and forts and hills, but also means a lot of intelligence, information campaigns, diplomacy. All these come together beautifully in Pratapgarh campaign. There are much larger enemies coming to face him, and at that time Chhatrapati Shivaji doesn't have anything to show. He has no track record to show that he is capable of defeating Afzal Khan, which is where somebody like Kanoji Jede becomes very important. Afzal Khan comes and starts giving out watans and money gifts. So Kanoji Jede comes to Chhatrapati Shivaji and says that I am not willing to give up my watan to or my lands to Afzal Khan, you please take them. And this one single act of Kanoji Jede stops any and all other Maratha Sardars from going over to Afzal Khan's side. You find that he chooses Pratapgarh very correctly, to being at the border of his territory. First, he prevents Afzal Khan from drawing him out of Rajgarh towards Indapur, which is a flat area, towards Supe and Indapur areas, which is the flat area near Pune. He keeps himself confined to the hill forts. He creates a situation, he creates this rumor that he is totally scared of Afzal Khan. And all this caused complacency to be created in Afzal Khan's mind, in the Adil Shah camp. We move on to Pratapgarh. Chhatrapati Shivaji has absolutely immaculate knowledge of all his hill forts. He knows which fort to select. He knows the spot on which the Shamiana should be erected, so that the gunners on the fort can see the Shamiana, but from the Shamiana cannot see the gunners. This is how accurately he selected the spot for the meeting. It is a newly built fort. Why Pratapgarh? Why not other forts? It is very recently built, just 2 or 3 years ago. So the chance that somebody from Adil Shah's camp will know about this fort is precluded. Nobody has been to the fort before. It is an older fort. There is always the chance that there might be somebody in Afzal Khan's camp saying, I know the layout of this fort completely. That is precluded. Afzal Khan puts forces all around Pratapgarh. Shivaji Maharaj managed to put counter forces in each and every location, exactly on the place that Afzal Khan has put them. And I covered in Battles of the Maratha Empire, the Pratapgarh campaign. Read it, you will find that a lot of small things which show Chhatrapati's genius through as a warrior and as somebody who has complete knowledge of the situation. Doesn't get drawn into battles, doesn't get provoked into battles. He faces personal loss at the same time. Saibai dies in this same time period, and maybe a lesser person would have said that because of this event, let us call off whatever we are doing, this meeting, and we will meet at it. But at that point, by this time, Chhatrapati Shiva deployed so many troops and has worked so much towards defeating Afzal Khan that to draw out of the campaign would be very risky, because it will completely come undone. It is very difficult to again set the trap for Afzal Khan like this. So he takes the personal loss in his stride of losing his queen, comes back to Pratapgarh, and then kills Afzal Khan. Most importantly is the activity that Chhatrapati Shivaji did on killing of Afzal Khan. And not only in this case, but even after defeating Shaista Khan, or when he had finally managed to start taking the hill forts given to Aurangzeb, is that you find that when Chhatrapati Shivaji replies, there is always a loss from the other side. But till that time, most of the victories on the Indian side have been maintenance of status quo. But Chhatrapati Shivaji's every victory we see that it means imposing a cost on the invader. Afzal Khan comes and Aditya ends up losing Kolhapur in return. It would have been easy for Shivaji Maharaj to just stay at Pratapgarh, evict Afzal Khan, defeat his army, and then he would have still been great. But instead he goes to Kolhapur, all the way to Kolhapur. Nitoji Palkar goes right up to Bijapur. And this is the kind of cost that Adil Shah has to bear for sending his one general across to Pratapgarh. We find Shaista Khan, Daud Khan come and invade Pune. Shaista Khan's fingers get cut or thumbs get cut and is sent out. Jaswant Singh defeated at Sinhgarh. But Shivaji Maharaj replies, "We are going to Surat." And making good that cost from the Mughal Empire which he has suffered in Pune. We find that Diler Khan takes 23 forts. Shivaji Maharaj waits out 5 years, 6 years. When he returns, 23 forts are taken back, but the Mughals also lose Nashik, apart from losing the 23 forts. So this is one crucial aspect of Shivaji Maharaj strategizing, that he always imposes a cost on the adversary. He attacks, of course, he has to, but when faced with the attack, the reply is always in this kind. So this is obviously the Shivaji Maharaj strategizing in terms of the Pratapgarh battle and his guerrilla warfare.
Moving ahead in the chronology, when we come in the middle of the Maratha Empire, we have two brave Maratha generals, that is Santaji Ghorpade and Dhanaji Jadhav. What were the typical, say, differences or say familiarities in their tactics deployed for battle versus those deployed by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj?
Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj was operating on a very limited area. Even at the peak of his career, when he got crowned as Chhatrapati, the lands which he governed were limited to what is the belt today from Nashik district down to Kolhapur district and the coast on the one side. This had a lot of hill forts, forests, ravines, and he had a much centralized rule also in this part, and he used those hills and ravines very effectively against adversaries who were at that time surrounding the Maratha Empire or Maratha Kingdom from all sides. He had the Mughals on the north and to the east. He had the Adil Shah of Bijapur to the south. He had the Siddi of Janjira to the west. He had the European powers to the west. And in between he had managed to grow this Swarajya, which faced attacks on all sides. His later part of the campaign comes to Dakshin Digvijay, where he manages to win a series of victories all the way down to Jinji and establish a post in Tamil Nadu, that is Jinji. Post his death, we find Chhatrapati Sambhaji has to contend with the Mughals. Now, the Mughals come with a very large army, which is counting all the camp followers, supporters, etc., so 5 lakh men in total. We've set up camp at a place called Khadki, which is today Aurangabad. And it is believed that this camp took up some 30 miles circumference, more or less functioned like a town. So the Marathas have to now change tactics. First of all, President Sambhaji fights against them. But in the decade after Chhatrapati Shivaji's death, in 1680 to 1690, we find that the two southern kingdoms, two southern sultanates, Bijapur, Golconda, they both lost to Aurangzeb. And now the Marathas have to redefine their strategy, because if they keep fighting within the hills of the Sahyadris, they are going to lose eventually, because you are trapped from all sides against an army hell-bent on defeating you. So the plan now under Chhatrapati Rajaram is to diffuse the fighting, and that is why he escapes to Jinji. He escapes to Jinji and he opens fronts against the Mughals all across the Deccan, from the Sahyadris to Jinji. Here is where Santaji and Dhanaji really come to the fore as generals, the commanders of the Maratha army, where they sort of have the intelligence and the guerrilla techniques of Shivaji Maharaj times with them, and they are one step in the future also, in which they are now covering large distances, because large land masses was something that Shivaji Maharaj did not have to deal with for most of the time. Here we are talking of distances all the way from Pune to Bangalore, Bangalore to Chennai in today's terms. Sanjay Dhanaji carry out small guerrilla attacks on the Mughals throughout this line, and they are also swift enough to escape from being persecuted, from being captured, from dying at the hand of the Mughals. We find that these 17 years consists of them moving very swiftly between provinces, between areas, and harassing the Mughals throughout. A change comes about in which the lands are then parcelled out to various Sardars, which is the forerunner of the Maratha Empire. But the result being that a greater number of Maratha Sardars begin these harassment tactics against the Mughals, leading eventually, as you know, to the victory of the Maratha Empire over the Mughal Empire in 1707.
So Anishji, as you said that after the death of Aurangzeb, it was considered as victory of Maratha Empire because they survived. So now the game was, ball was on our court, right? There is again a big battle which comes to our mind is Bajirau's Palkhed battle. So during that time also Bajirao had faced heavy artillery from Nizam. He had attacked Maratha kingdom and still he won that battle, and it was a very decisive victory. So please elaborate us with that battle.
Yeah. So as you said that Aurangzeb died, Mughal armies went back north, and the Marathas, although they had survived this warfare, there was still a lot of loss on their side also. They had lost thousands of men, and the land was totally desolate. But then they picked themselves up out of the situation through the offices of Chhatrapati Shahu and Bahaji Vishwanath, the first Peshwa. They slowly resurrected the situation, and we finally come to 1720 when Peshwa Bajirao gets appointed the Peshwa. This is the time when the Nizam also establishes him. 1724 he establishes himself at Hyderabad, and now the Nizam has his sights on the Malwa. He is not content with being just in Hyderabad. He has his sights on Malwa and Bundelkhand. And the greatness of Peshwa Bajirao is that he cut the Nizam to size and restricted him to the Deccan. He became a provincial ruler. But from being a ruler with national ambition, the Nizam becomes a ruler with just his province, a provincial ruler. That is the greatness of Peshwa Bajirao in cutting him down to size. And the battle which truly defines this is Palkhed, which is, as I said, quite well known. The first difference we see between Palkhed and earlier battles is the kind of distances being covered. I will give a short background of what is Palkhed battle. So, Peshwa Bajirao is untested at that time. Nobody knows anything about it. He's just about 28 years old maybe. Chhatrapati Shahu is at Satara. Peshwa Bajirao is somewhere south. Now the Nizam crosses the borders and he comes with a huge artillery park. He has lots of guns, heavy guns with him. Again, you go back to the earlier campaign, much earlier of Afzal Khan. Tactic is similar, that you draw the Peshwa out on the open field. He knows Marathas don't have good artillery with them, and decimate them on the open field battle. So Peshwa Bajirao has to now fight without engaging the guns of the Nizam. He first goes north and enters the Nizam's territory. So now Nizam has to protect his own territory. As a result, he is drawn out of Satara. Then the Peshwa Bajirao, I have put this map in the book also, and he moves east, he moves towards Surat. He goes meets the local Mughal Faujdar, and he sends out this rumor that the local Mughal Faujdar has united with him to attack the Nizam. Then Nizam then stops. He again goes back towards Pune. And Bajirao then, this is a ruse because nobody is going to, Mughal Faujdar has not decided to accompany him. Bajirao Peshwa leaves Surat, he comes back. Now he threatens Aurangabad, which is at that time the Nizam's capital. So here is where the beauty of Bajirao Peshwa's campaign comes through, is that the Nizam and Bajirao are both almost equidistant from the from the Godavari. And if the Nizam manages to cross the Godavari with his artillery, it will be very difficult for Bajirao. So he has to reach, and there is only one place they can cross. Now these are times where you cannot build bridges instantly across the river. You do not have the modern technologies. Shallow parts, places where there is a natural crossing, these are very heavily guarded, much sought after. So Bajirao Peshwa's knowledge of geography is excellent. He knows exactly where Nizam is going to cross. He has to forestall the Nizam. He knows that there is a place called Palkhed where the Nizam will most likely cross his path after crossing Puntamba. And the Nizam will take his supplies at Palkhed once he has crossed. So the Peshwa descends from a ghat which is totally unknown. It is from a route that normally soldiers don't descend by. If I remember the name correctly, Pasaranitsa Ghat. He takes that, now there is a road through it, but he takes that route and he reaches there 3 days before Nizam does. He reaches Palkhed, completely surrounds the village. He bribes, there is a tribe called Banjaras, and that tribe used to supply armies. That tribe used to supply armies with food and water, and obviously at a price. So all the supplies are purchased by Peshwa Bajirao. Whatever other supplies, some of the supplies set on fire. The Nizam finds out that already he is at Palkhed. In fact, he then leaves his artillery on this side of the Godavari, crosses over with the belief that he will be able to catch Peshwa Bajirao in time. Unfortunately for him, what happens is that he is trapped on one side of the Godavari, his artillery on the other side of the Godavari, and is completely surrounded from all sides. There is no water available for him to drink. There are two rivers. One is Godavari, 20 miles away. So the Peshwa allows him to proceed 20 miles in. Once he inside 20 miles, Mallar Rao Holkar comes from the south and blocks off his retreat to the Godavari. There is a second river called the Shiv River in Palkhed, which Peshwa Bajirao himself is guarding. Two water sources are completely blocked. The Nizam cannot feed water to the army. 3 days of surviving without water, finally the Nizam comes and surrenders. The beauty of Palkhed is that he fights some skirmishes before reaching Palkhed here and there, and he then tries to sort of fight his way out of Palkhed, but it is a dead cause before the fight begins. And the beauty of Peshwa Bajirao's strategizing here is that he does it over such large distances in Maharashtra, northern Maharashtra, and further on even in Malwa, where by having very accurate knowledge of geography, of having intelligence much more superior to the Nizam, and knowing his strengths 100%, he manages to win the battle without fighting any. And we see the same example is also there in Bhopal 10 years later. Similar example is there in Bundelkhand. Very similar example is there in Vasai, but Vasai still a battle had to be fought, but again the strategizing is quite similar. So this is how we find that without having the modern maps to aid him, Peshwa Bajirao managed to strategize over distances over 600-700 kilometers. When he, especially at Bhopal, when he defeats the Nizam again, second time, he is blocking off routes at places which are 700 kilometers away. At that time, you don't have any kind of maps. Modern maps don't exist. Survey of India is still 100 years in the future. You have maps which are localized. The maps which are not localized are very rudimentary and out of scale maps. To be able to think and visualize, we have a map of India in our brains ready for visualizing. So if I talk to you about Delhi, Bhopal, Satara, Nagpur, Aurangabad, you immediately have a India map in front of your eyes, and we will point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places. So we can visualize very easily. Now you try to imagine these places without the Indian map in front of you. It's very difficult. And Peshwa Bajirao not only managed to imagine, he managed to carry out a strategy over these places and trapped the Nizam not once but 2 times. And this is something that really unique about his strategy or warfare. This is what we can see from Peshwa Bajirao. And of course, the swift moving cavalry was his forte because they didn't have the guns to match the forces of the Nizam. The swift moving cavalry was the best bet, which again Peshwa used to full effect by not encumbering them with too many camp followers and such types, which became a problem 20 years after he died in Panipat.
Anishji, while studying Battle of Palkhed, we came across new harassment tactics which was used against Nizam. In Marathi, it is called as Firta Vedha. So, what it is and how it is actually was helpful in Battle of Palkhed.
So, as I mentioned earlier, the Nizam crossed the Godavari at Puntamba with his artillery still on the other side of the river, and now he had to cover this about 20 miles to Palkhed. So, what Bajirao did at this point, Peshwa Bajirao did is he started his harassment tactics as soon as the Nizam crossed over. But at the same time, because he wanted to drive him to Palkhed, in such a way he did the harassment that the Nizam had to cross Palkhed. As it is, the route was through Palkhed, but maybe the Nizam would have taken a different route. Is a chance. But by Kirapan, which you call Firta Vedha, is that he did harassment tactics for about 2 villages before Palkhed, small villages. Maratha soldiers came out and they attacked the flanks of the Nizam's army. They attacked him in such a way that he did not have to completely stop. They attacked the flanks, allowed him to proceed. Attacked the flank, allowed him to proceed. So that there was some loss suffered by him, and at the same time he had to reach Palkhed for supplies and help. So this is how that Firta Vedha became important in the Palkhed campaign, that it precluded any chance of the Nizam taking any other route and drove him to Palkhed where the Peshwa was waiting for him. And the rest of course I have described earlier.
Speaking of the entire Maratha clan, starting from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj to the last of the Peshwas, one fact which we notice often is that there is not a continuous narration of all the events. I mean, things are learned or being taught or are known in bits and pieces. Like say for example, in the case of Peshwas, everybody talks a lot about how they lost Panipat war, but nobody talks about the real beauty of the Peshwas, that at that time they had their empire starting from Tungabhadra in the south till Attock in the northwest province and till Cuttack in the eastern province. So what I would like to know is, what were the exact strategies deployed by the Marathas after the loss of Panipat war, or let's say for example simultaneously in other parts of India or say other parts of the world? What were the strategies deployed by other parts? Were there any differences or any similarities between them?
So the Marathas lost at Panipat, as we all know, 1761, and as I mentioned that yes, there is a combined narrative that doesn't exist, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book. That instead of, it started off as a series of articles. Some of these chapters have appeared earlier as articles in publications, but I found that instead of trying to clarify every doubt with a separate article or speech, because somebody will come up with a doubt about Chhatrapati Shivaji, second person will not be knowing about Chhatrapati Sambhaji, third person will be having zero knowledge about Peshwa Bajirao, then will come up saying Panipat was the last defeat for the Marathas, will be oblivious about Ahilya Hoilkar, and then there is a total lack of knowledge as far as the fights between the East India Company and the Marathas are concerned. So I believe that a narrative, a book which bound all these together was needed, so that all kinds of misconceptions or wrong knowledge about the Maratha Empire can be cleared in one work, which is why I wrote Battles of the Maratha Empire. And instead of just making it a general commentary of all the personas or events which happened from A to Z, I decided to focus on the battles, so make it more interesting and really focus on what changed the scenario, the pivotal battles, as a result of which politics changed, administration changed in the country. Now we come into first I got a Battle of Panipat, which itself was a prototype of what the world was going to see in the next 30-40 years. At Panipat, we find that Sadashiv Rao had tried to deploy what we later on called the infantry square. Napoleon deployed this very effectively. Only problem was that perhaps Sadashiva did not fully understand the implications of the tactic, or even if he understood, the other Maratha Sardars maybe did not understand. He tried to build a large rectangle in which all the camp followers and supplies were kept in the center. He put the artillery of Ibrahim Khan Gardi on the front, the heavy artillery in front. The aim was that Gardi will simply blow a hole through the Afghan defense, and then they will carry this entire rectangle through to Delhi. It succeeded initially because this tactic was new. To open the attack with the heavy artillery and your muskets was new tactic even for the Afghans. They lost about 8 to 9,000 soldiers, but this is where the Marathas erred, in that they fully understand the tactic being used, and once the 8,000 have been killed, their cavalry rushed forward, and this is why you find the depictions of the Panipat warfare, that Ibrahim Khan Gardi had to stop firing because his own soldiers were in front of him after the initial attacks. This is where they went wrong. It was a case of not fully understanding the warfare being utilized. From 1761, in fact slightly before that, to the close of the 19th century is the time when your industrial revolution takes place. All your machines which you are even today existing, your lathe machine, your drill machine, the engine, and all the basic machines, they have all their forerunners in this part of the century in Europe. As a result, one of the basic changes that takes place is that the European powers are able to manufacture guns in a much larger number. And we come straight to Napoleon, because the best example of the Industrial Revolution being put to use is Napoleon Bonaparte, where we find first time that European powers are able to defeat Asian powers 5 times, 6 times their number, just by dint of having correct strategies, which is how Napoleon manages to win in Egypt. Now they say that numbers by Napoleon are exaggerated. They were not 20 times their number, they were 6 times. But even if you are facing an army 6 times and still manage to win, it is still a great victory. And Napoleon managed to fully refine this infantry square. So the logic that your numerically strong army is going to defeat a numerically weaker army is completely shattered, which is a very profound change in warfare. Because up to that point, if I have 100 soldiers and if you have 150 soldiers, it is every chance that I will lose. Except some rare situations where some accident happens, king gets killed, people get demoralized, somebody changes sides, etc., etc. But in a state contest, if numbers are more, you would win. That was the logic being followed, and this is the logic that is put forward even for Panipat, that the numbers game is what the Marathas lost. But it is also possible that Sadashivrao Bhau was not thinking in terms of numbers game, that he was already thinking in terms of defeating numerically superior armies with lesser number of people, which, if it had been carried to its logical conclusion, might well have saved the Maratha Empire and India from the East India Company. But if you are going to start thinking in 1761 those lines, if you carry that thought forward by 1802 when they lost, it would have been quite refined. The main problem for Maratha was that they did not study or analyze the Panipat defeat the way they should have. I think there is more literature written on the Panipat defeat in 20th century than there are written in the 18th century. And when I come to this point, is that warfare had become scientific in other part of the world. Not only the Industrial Revolution, but the way armies went about planning, armies went about strategizing. It had given up its methods of numerical strength and all this, and it had turned really scientific and how we should strategize. By 1818, when the Marathas fully lost, the East India Company was in a position where they could calculate the exact number of days required to besiege a fort and take it. That is something that was absent from Maratha side. Coming on to Panipat, 18 years after Panipat, we find that the Marathas have managed to defeat the British at Vadgaon. Again, the tactic used is something like scorched earth, which are again covered in the book. It was a tactic deployed by the Russians against Napoleon. But what happens after Vadgaon is most important, is that the British carried out a court-martial of the offending officers who had lost. Some of them had died, so obviously no court-martial for them. But those who had survived, they were court-martialed by the East India Company. Some of them were sent home. They found why they have lost. One of the main reasons they lost was that they did not have a proper road to connect Mumbai to Lonavala and further to Pune. So they could not carry their guns across the Ghat, which is what made them lose. And one of the first things that 20 years after this event, one of the first things they did under Wellesley was to build a road connecting Mumbai to Pune, which was one of the first proper roads built by the British Empire in India. We don't see that kind of alacrity or that kind of sincerity to face the Panipat debacle among the Marathas. The problems which are there at Panipat of not having centralized command, of not understanding the warfare that's happening. Basically, we find the 18th century accounts says that all the people who were involved in Panipat have more or less died. Mallarao Holkar and Gaikwad of Gujarat are the only two important surviving members. There is only one instance of them heading south to meet the Peshwa to talk about the Panipat defeat. Before they reach, Peshwa Nana Sahib has already died. And so we find in Maratha chronicles there is absolutely no record of whether a discussion took place regarding the Panipat defeat as to what went wrong. Usually it is now modern parlance, if we go through some accident happens, if it goes wrong, the first thing we have to do is find out what went wrong and then try to rectify it. This approach was never taken. So the problems which existed at the time of Panipat continued further, and even when Maharji Shinde later on tried to adopt European tactics with this infantry heavy contingents, they were, first of all, the Marathas did not train themselves in the new warfare. They employed French, Scots, Germans, British, which is a mistake that Shivaji Maharaj never did. As a result, because they did not teach themselves the new warfare, when the East India Company attacked, all these mercenaries promptly deserted, and the battles that we find, unfortunately, at Lashkari, at Delhi, at Agra, the French and other Europeans have completely left the Marathas. They have been left leaderless, and this infantry artillery combination, which requires very good leadership in place, there was none in place, which is why they lost against the British Empire. And of course then there was a case of internal fighting. They never united together against the British. It was always the Scindias faced them first, Bhosle faced them with them, Yashwantrao Holkar faced them afterwards, and once all this was done, then finally Peshwa Bajirao II woke up and decided to fight against the British, by which time only thing he had in hand was his little strip of land on western Maharashtra. Everything else was in British hands. So this is another reason why they lost, is that they did not unite against the British.
I wish to touch base on two aspects of the Peshwas. One is the Marathas raided Bengal province and Odisha province, and second is when we speak of any battle, it need not be a battle just to be fought on land. It could be an ideological battle also, it could be a cultural battle also. So I need your inputs on these two aspects, as the Marathas raid on Bengal province, and secondly, what did Ahilyabai Holkar did actually to revolutionize the empire at that time in terms of cultural battle, we can say.
So the Bengal raid of the Maratha Empire, basically it's about Raghuji Bhosle of Nagpur invading Bengal. This happens in about 6 or 7 raids approximately for 9 years, from 1742 to 1751. And the reason for the invasion is that the Subedar of the Odisha province, he comes to Nagpur and he has a bone to pick with Alivardi Khan, that is the Nawab of Bengal. Raghuji Bhosle takes it as the opportunity to invade Bengal itself. Now, over the course of 9 years, one of the problems that has happened is that while Odisha passed under Maratha rule and was under Maratha rule properly from about 1751 to 1803, after facing these attacks, Odisha faced some of these attacks, Bengal also faced some attacks, because altogether one province under the Bengal Nawab Finally, 1751, Raghuji Bhosle annexed the Orissa part of it. Bengal part remained as it is. In Odisha, as administrators, the Marathas did a lot of good work. Not too many people know the amount of work done for Jagannath Puri by the Marathas or the Bhosles of Nagpur. From 1751 right up to 1803, when continuously some of their contribution is coming from the Bhosles of Nagpur for the Jagannath Puri temple. A temple which has faced about 17-18 invasions before that to various powers, but the Nagpur Bhosles totally rejuvenate the temple. There are regular grants being made, lands are attached for its upkeep. Even today, if you go to Jagannath Puri, you find there is right in front of the temple a stamba is been erected. It's an old pillar called Arun Stamba. Originally belongs to the Konark temple. Konark temple, even in those times, was completely defunct as a temple. Even today, it's almost about to fall down. So, that stamba they have brought from there, and it is now being worshipped in front of the Puri temple. Again, this chapter I have covered in Battles of the Maratha Empire as to the amount of contributions the Marathas made for Jagannath Puri, and once you have contributed Jagannath Puri, it automatically means that it will lead to prosperity of the surrounding area as a temple town. So, in Orissa, we find that cultural rejuvenation of the Puri temple, other temples also, was done by the Nagpur Bhosles once they became administrators. In Bengal, what happened was that they never reached the administrator stage. They remained at the invader stage. It is quite possible that if Bengal had also come entirely under the administration, you might have something similar to Puri over there also. Because the British, obviously British did a lot of bad thing, but if you see the British in their invader stage, they are trying to establish the rule. And later on, when they are to administer the country, when they have to administer the country, obviously there are a lot of things which they did which benefited them obviously, but it eventually benefited us also. As administrators, they were not as cruel as what they were when they were invaders. The British, for example, in 1857, they slaughtered the hundreds and thousands of people in the Doab region. But that kind of massacre didn't take place once, except the Bengal famine, which again brought about. You find that when you move from the attacking and warfaring and fighting stage and to administrative stage, the Marathas being very different. Plus, we come to the Bengal raids. A lot of the information as to what exactly happened has been gleaned from the singular work called Maharashtra Puran. The Maharashtra Puran is essentially a poet's work, and it is quite possible that a lot of the passages have been, poetically enhanced or something. Some of the numbers quoted are very weird. 4 lakh and 9 lakh people died and all this. It's very difficult to imagine how so many people died in those days. But yes, it was not a smooth sailing for them, because the Marathas were basically attacking Alivardi Khan in Bengal. But what we must note is the difference between Orissa and Bengal, where the Marathas became administrators, and in Bengal where they did not become administrators. So that is one chapter I would definitely suggest people to read. That is on Bhosles of Nagpur and Jagannath Puri. So coming to the second question, Ahilyabai Holkar. Ahilyabai Holkar ensured that the political control of the Marathas, which they established over the previous 80 years, 100 years, had the veneer of cultural dominance on it. That once you have this political control, what are you going to do about it? Is stuff going to continue as it is from before? Or how is it going to benefit the people who have been freed by the Marathas? So this is where Ahilyabai Holkar's work becomes very crucial, is that she built a lot of temples, dharamshalas, a lot of places where pilgrims could stay, Annakshetras, ghats. At a time when temples, usually even today we have this concept called temple town. There are a lot of towns in India where the temple basically drives the economy of the place. Puri is one example. We will have in Maharashtra, Pandharpur is one example. Jejuri is another example, where pilgrims come to the temple and all the connected activities drive the economy of the place. Whether it is the transport companies which bring pilgrims there, their facilities for staying, facilities for food, people involved, pujaris involved. So it's not just a case of building a temple. You are actually giving a boost to the economy, the local economy. This is what Ahilya Holkar did by building these temples all across India and these ghats and mandirs. She provided the cultural and social boost or the veneer required on the political conquest. Without the political conquest which preceded it was totally impossible, because the Mughals used to stop pilgrimages, Mughals used to demolish temples. From that to go to this was a huge achievement, which is the importance of Ahilya Bai Holkar in this.
So Anishji, our Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj built an empire using forts, which forts were in complete restoration phase during Peshwa era as well. But what happened after that? I mean, in 1818, as we all know, that Maratha Empire fell and all the power went to British. But no one speaks about what happens to forts after that.
So in 1818, by 1818, that Maratha lost everything else. All their empire more or less had come down to what is the hill forts in Maharashtra. And the British began a campaign around February of that year, where they started attacking the forts of Sinhgarh and Purandar. Before that, some smaller forts had been taken in January, the Kannaya, Siddhagarh. Mainly the campaign begins with Sinhgarh and Purandar being taken in Feb and March of 1818. And we find that over the next 5-6 months, all the forts of the Sahyadris have fallen to the British. That is right up to Salem. Mulher falls in July of the year. Between 200-300 forts are surrendered. Now, up to that point, those forts are functioning forts, because all British have to fight and take them, means they are all functioning forts. In the sense that they have the infrastructure on them to support 1000, 1200, 500, whatever the size of the fort is. Those many people are there on the fort, or at least the infrastructure, water, living facilities, food facilities, these are there on top of these forts for supporting them. And what is not usually known is that from 1818, being at this point where you could support 1200 soldiers on Sinhgarh, it came to a position in 1841 that most of the forts were ruined and deserted, and nobody went on those forts. Why it happened is that Elphinstone, Mount Stuart Elphinstone actually brought out a circular saying that the forts had to be completely destroyed. So of course, some destruction had happened after that also, because the vagaries of nature and vagabonds and stuff, some wall which may actually at a time fell down, but 95% of destruction was being done by Elphinstone. Very simply, he broke away the access routes. Then in some places, for example at Lohagarh we find that the British generally went there. There was a rumor that the tank at Lohagarh had a huge treasure buried inside, beneath all the water. So he drained the tank. He dug a hole, a tunnel next to the tank, drained it. The entire tank was drained, or no treasure was found, but that tank is still in the same condition as before, without the water. Other places the water sources are completely, tanks are broken, so that we cannot fill any water. Many places the granary, for example Jivdhan, if you have been to Jivdhan, you will find that there is a granary, old granary, which is still about knee deep with burnt grain. That granary was set on fire in 1818. It had a full stock of grain which was set on fire. Many Jivdhan steps were broken. You find the last part, broken steps for Jivdhan, those are actually blown apart by a East India Company gun. Many of those places you will find this. Wherever you find that the steps have a definite sign of being blown away. Alang is another example. It is very odd that you find the staircase goes up 5 steps, then there is a hole in between, then another 5 steps are after that. So this is where the British have actually either put mines or bombs and blown away. Once you blow away the access route, it's very difficult for the fort. So infrastructure was also mined. All the equipment, guns were all taken out. In fact, one reference I put up in Twitter someday, it is a proper letter sent by the Ahmednagar collector, Henry Pottinger, to a person asking him to demolish 6 forts, and he has supplied milk and rations for a demolition to be carried out by 200 people. So this is how the British went from fort to fort. Why they did it? Because Elphinstone reckoned it is too difficult for him to maintain garrison on every fort, military garrison. Already you had established garrisons in Pune, land-based cantonments. And the British reckoned that land-based cantonments guarding cities are the future instead of having hilltop cantonments, which is what Shivaji Maharaj had built actually. But the majority destruction had taken place by the East India Company something, and by Elphinstone, after whom we have colleges and roads in Mumbai, is something not known to many people. You see how much destruction was carried out. Usually we associate East India Company or the British with preservation of archaeological artifacts. But the amount of destruction they carried out on the hill forts of Maharashtra is quite mind-boggling. And some of the hill forts survived. Lohargarh survived till 1845 as a hill fort, guarding your Borghat. Fort at Chakan near Pune survived till 1858 as a fort properly. But I think that is more or less the last fort which survived as a fort, 1858. But now, as you can see, there is not a single fort which is still existing in its previous form.
Anishji, after the books Sahyadri to Hindu Kush, Brahmaputra and Battle of Maratha Empires, which are your upcoming projects?
So, Battle of Maratha Empire was released quite recently, my latest book. I'm planning a second volume of this book because some battles which are not as pivotal or as game changing as the ones mentioned, but there are some battles which are quite interesting but not known well enough. I intend to cover battles of the Maratha Navy in it, also some battles such as Kartarab Khan versus Chhatrapati Shivaji, and couple of battles which took place within what are today urban city areas. Battle of Khadki, for example, which takes place across the area today occupied by the Pune University. And we have the Battle of Sitabardi in Nagpur, which is again a cantonment built exactly after the battle. It happens in, again that area is now center of Nagpur. And few other battles also, which I will cover. Some other cultural aspects also. Again, this book is not just battles but cultural aspects also, as we have seen in case of Ahilya Holkar and Jagannath Puri. So one, I will take up the coronation of Chhatrapati Shivaji, where a lot of misconceptions are being created. Nowadays, big hot topic on social media, especially regarding the priest who presided over the function. And in spite of all having all kinds of information ready in public domain, still some false information keeps floating around. So the coronation of Chhatrapati Shivaji, as to how it really mattered, what is the importance of coronation, something I will cover in the next book, and then of course for the few topics which are not fully finalized as it. So that will be my next work.
Thank you, Mr. Anish, for being with us today. It was a really very great session to be with you on the Battle of Marathas, and we wish you the very best for your upcoming projects.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me. And it was a pleasure to be talking on these topics with you. I found questions very interesting and really went into the topic very deeply. And I wish this YouTube channel all the best. I hope that they get lots and lots of more subscribers. I find that they have that you have already done YouTube videos with quite a few personalities popular in this literary field. I just hope that you proceed even further and it becomes a huge hit, because I believe this kind of channel is really required to bring the knowledge and bring the viewpoints of various people to the larger public. So again, thank you, thanks a lot, enjoyed it.
So friends, this was historian and author Mr. Anish Gokhale with us on our channel Rashtra Sevak. Do let us know your thoughts on our comments box, and do stay tuned for future.
Thank you.